Okay, so let's pick back up with the Mongol rule of Russia now. So, despite the fact that in the previous video I was saying we tend to really focus the height of Mongol rule with that centered in China. That's true. Kublai Khan was definitely the most powerful of Genghis Khan's successors, but the Mongolian rule of Russia is still very significant because it increases that contact between East and West. And also, it is the Russian princes who are still ruling in this region that eventually are going to take power from the Mongols and establish modern Russia as we know it. So, the Golden Horde, as we call the Mongolian Khanate in Russia, was originally ruled by a man named Batu, Batu. And the Golden Horde was always controlled by Kublai Khan's relatives, either his brothers or his cousins. And they lived in Russia, but also went on expeditions through Poland, Hungary, and even Eastern Germany. So the Khanate of the Golden Horde, you can see, really reaches pretty far west. They did not. Oh, they were actually mostly interested in this area north of the Black Sea, and also the steppes farther east along the Volga River. And the reason why that was because this was perfect grazeland. So the farther north they went, it was more forest land, and they weren't interested in that. So they let the local princes continue to rule and pay tribute to them. So that again is the reason why modern Russia is eventually born. The princes were princes of a region called Muscovy, and that is where modern Moscow is. And so once they drive out the remaining Mongol rulers from the region in the 15th century, modern Russia is born, which we already talked about. If you don't remember, go look up those previous videos on this playlist. So in any case, one of the differences with the Mongolian rule in Russia that we don't see in some of the other empires is that there's a little bit more resistance towards the Mongolian rule in this region because it's a Christian region. They established their capital, Sarai, on the Volga River, pretty close to the Caspian Sea, prime time steppe region, pastoral land over here. And the Mongol hordes maintained control of the Crimean Peninsula actually until the late 18th century. So there was continued Mongol influence over Russia even when the Mongols were driven out of the region. So, for example, Russia had improved military organization and shifted more towards centralized leadership. It also began to develop more of a unique and distinct Russian identity as the Mongolian invasion isolated Russia from Western Europe. So one of the reasons why, if you remember from our studies of Russia, the early pre-Peter the Great, pre-Westernization Russian society was very different from Western Europe. And some of that is because of their constant contact with the Mongols. And the Mongols also rule a Khanate in Persia, which was called the Ilkhanate of Persia. This was founded by Kublai Khan's brother, Hugalu, and he captured the capital of the Abbasid dynasty, Baghdad, and he established the Ilkhanate in 1258. He also assassinated the sitting caliph at the time, and then slaughtered 200,000 citizens. So this wasn't exactly a peaceful transition into power here. He did not expand farther into Syria because the people that lived there. Whoa, where's my pointer? He didn't expand up into this region because the people set up military forces and stopped them from expanding any further. So they don't get into the Mamluk territory farther into Egypt. And also the Turks stopped them from going too far into this region here. Like most other Khans, Hugalu was better as a conqueror than an administrator. So this lack of governing skills also contributed to the eventual decline of the Mongol rule in Persia. They were indirect rulers. They kept the Persian bureaucrats in place, and they did that because they wanted to maintain maximum tax collection. And the Mongols in the Ilkhanate began to adapt the culture of the people that were there. So many of them began to convert to Islam, and they also became less tolerant of Jews and Christians in the region. So that's an interesting adaptation of culture in both directions. The Mongols, the way they ruled in Persia, like I said earlier, they maintained most of the local leadership. Mongols did occupy the highest administrative posts, but there also were Persian ministers and provincial governors and state officials. And the local rule ensured stability because the average person really didn't notice a difference. And it also maintained efficient tax collection. And there were many other examples of how the Mongols assimilated into Persian traditions. There was a lot of religious tolerance. There were Muslims, Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, and Jews all living in the region. And the Muslim privilege that was left over from the Abbasid Caliphate. So, for example, the tax relief ended actually once the Mongols took over the Ilkhanate of Persia. And later in the Khanate, most Mongols converted to Islam. For example, in 1295, the Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam, and the majority of his subjects followed his example. But over time, towards the end of the Khanate, religious toleration starts to decline. Part of this is because there's just general conflict between Muslims and Christians and Jews during this period, because this is overlapping with the Crusades. And over time, Christians and Jews in Persia start to experience much more persecution, and many of them are killed. The Mongols often integrate with Eurasian culture. They have a courier service, which maintained a safe, long-distance method of communication between East and West. There were relay stations along the courier routes, which allowed travelers to stop and restock supplies. They could even buy a new horse. So in this way, they could have journeys with far fewer interruptions. The Mongols, in terms of trade, in general, they facilitated trade networks and allowed traders to travel routes without obstacles. So despite the fact that the Mongols conquered regions, after these conquests, the areas were much safer. The Mongolian involvement helped trade become easier, and lands as distant as China and Rome were much more closely connected thanks to the Mongol trade. So remember that those trade networks were pretty open during the classical era, not so much during most of the post-classical era, but here we go. It was thanks to the Mongols that East and West are connected yet again. In terms of diplomatic missions, we also have quite a bit of that. The Mongols established embassies in distant empires, and they willingly received ambassadors from other nations. They helped secure Mongol alliances with distant places. Most notably, they had alliances with Western Europe against Muslims in Southwest Asia. And there were also missionary efforts. So the safer trade across Eurasia actually allowed missionaries to go to much more far-reaching places on Earth. The Sufis, for example, traveled throughout Central Asia to gain Muslim converts. And also Nestorian Christians gained converts in China. So this is way before the age of exploration and colonialism in the 16th century, where you see Europeans making these conversions. This is happening way, way before this. And the degree of religious toleration in Mongol empires allowed religious information to spread really easily. And you also see that there was resettlement. So the Mongols recruited talent from throughout Eurasia and resettled them into Mongolian lands. So if you know anything about the era of Peter the Great, you might remember that he also recruited people from all over Western Europe specifically to try to introduce talent into his empire. So the Mongols are doing the same exact thing here. They recruit artisans, craftsmen, government administrators to bring their talent. And Uyghurs, actually, from Central Asia and basically West China, were often relocated to serve the Mongols. They tended to be very well educated and literate, and they often served administrative duties, and occasionally quite often, they served in the military. And the Mongols would often recruit people from the populations that they conquered for the military and also for bureaucratic positions. So, for example, when they were conducting censuses throughout their region, they would seek out available talent. And what's interesting is that one of the most far-reaching examples was a man named Guillaume Boucher. He was a goldsmith from France that moved all the way to Karakorum in Mongolia because of his talents as a goldsmith. So that shows you how big of a connection they have. So this strong Eurasian integration encouraged more lines of communication across large distances. And last but not least, let's talk about the Mongolian decline. So first, the Ilkhanate in Persia falls apart, largely due to economic troubles. So in the 1290s, the Ilkhan introduced paper currency. And the reason why was they, over time, actually the goal was for the return to gold currency, but there were many debts. So many merchants actually were refusing to accept paper currency, and they closed their shops. And merchants also started to boycott the exchange of paper currency until the Ilkhan rescinded his power. He never did that. He ended up dying in 1304. And then 30 years after that, the last Mongolian ruler in Persia died with no heir. And then after that, the Ilkhanate in Persia ended, basically due to lack of leadership, right? So it was a fairly short-lived dynasty in Persia. And after that, Persia was ruled locally until the late 14th century when the Ottoman Empire arose, which we'll talk about eventually. And in China, the Yuan dynasty also declined, mainly for economic reasons. The paper money that they used diminished in value because the supply of bullion, or true gold and silver, was running low. So there was massive inflation in China. Also, a civil war broke out in the 1320s, and it also weakened the Khanate. And the Yuan dynasty officially came to an end in 1368 when a Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzheng overthrew the Yuan dynasty and established the Ming dynasty, which we'll talk about in period 4. And one of the last but very significant impacts that the Mongols bring across Eurasia is the bubonic plague. So it spread rapidly throughout Eurasia because of the extended trade networks that the Mongols opened up. And it killed up to 1/2 of the exposed population and 1/3 of the total population of Europe, about 25 million people. It further contributed to the decline of the Yuan dynasty. It would not, and at this point, the Persian Ilkhanate had already collapsed, but it definitely would have been gone if because of the plague. It reached Western Europe by the 15th century, so it actually more like the mid-13th century. So the peak of the Black Plague in Europe was 1347 to 1351. And they caused massive depopulation and labor shortages, large-scale peasant revolts, and also there were revolts as far east as the Mongolian capital as a result still of the plague. In any case, this is one of the most late but certainly devastating effects of Mongolian contact throughout Eurasia. After the plague breaks out, there are a couple of surviving Mongol Khanates, but not nearly as strong. There was one in Central Asia called the Khanate of Chagatai. It continued to control areas north of the Black Sea until the 18th century. And also there were descendants of Mongols who remained in Russia until the 20th century, but then they were removed by Stalin. So I just pointed that out because the Mongols decline in their central power by 1368, really the Mongols have a long-lasting influence because at this point their culture has spread so far across Eurasia. There is still a very high likelihood that someone living in Eurasia has a Mongolian ancestor. So this is a significant period of cross-cultural contact, and one that I think is a really good one to use if you're ever presented with a question on the AP exam where you're talking about trade, talking about these cross-continental exchanges. If you want to make an east-west connection, the Mongols are the keystone to that. So just keep that in mind if you ever come across a essay, any kind of complex question on the Mongols. So that's it, just 2 videos, hopefully pretty short and sweet for the Mongols. And we're almost finished with period 3, guys, so I look forward to moving on to period 4 with you all. Thanks for watching as always. Stay tuned and